Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Giles Milton. Giles is one of Britain's leading narrative historians, and he is absolutely brilliant at finding forgotten people and, I guess, forgotten events and telling absolutely compelling stories about them. And I can't easily pick out favourites because there's just such a huge variety in his writing, but one I was very struck by was his book about the destruction of Smyrna in Turkey back in 1922, and that was incredibly moving. And I'm sure that other people knew about that story, but I had absolutely no idea until I came across the book. And then, as a fan of all things Japanese, I massively enjoyed his book Samurai Williams, which is about the first Englishman to visit Japan. Although, slightly unfortunately, the way he got there was by getting shipwrecked. And then another example, there was the story about England's first colonies in America. And anyway, I'm just scratching the surface here. Giles has written, I think, about 12 books. And if you haven't found his work yet, I really recommend that you seek them out. Anyway, welcome, Giles, to the podcast.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on.
So we're going to talk about your book called White Gold, and that tells the story, and it's a really terrific story, about a man called Thomas Pellow and his life as a slave in Morocco. And I thought we might as well just drop the listeners straight into the action, so I'll set the scene a little bit. It's 1715. We're on board a small ship. I think it has a crew of 7, including the captain. But crucially, it has on board Thomas Pellow. And at this time, he's just 11 years old. So the ship, it's called the Francis. It's just about got home to England after a successful voyage to Genoa. And Giles, can you take up the story from there?
Yes, the crew have been away from home for many, many months. They're very much looking forward to getting back to their families after a profitable voyage. They were trading with Genoa with a cargo of pilchards, of all things. And they're nearing the mouth to the English Channel, in fact, when they sight the dreaded sight that every mariner feared at the time, which was the corsairs of Barbary, the ships of Barbary, the pirates of Barbary, who are preying at this time, and in fact have been for more than 100 years. They're preying on the shipping of Europe. They're preying on the ships of Portugal, of Spain, of France, of Italy, and of England. And so young Thomas Pellow and the mates on board, they look out and they see these ships coming towards them, and it is quite clear that these are corsairs from Barbary, and they are at great risk now of not only being captured, but if they're captured, they're going to be taken back to Morocco and they're going to be sold into slavery. So this is a really desperate moment for them that they're so close to home, and yet they're also so close to an absolute disaster.
But lucky for them, there's another ship that comes into view to rescue them.
Exactly. Well, there are two. There's the Francis, there's the George, and then there's actually a third ship which is quite heavily armed, actually, so with some big guns. And they think, well, we're going to be able to fight off these rather small, corsairing ships from Morocco. So a ferocious sea battle takes place. The Southwark, the third ship, has 16 big guns. It's firing all these, but the Salé, the ships from Morocco, from the port of Salé, they're very manoeuvrable. They're very fast. They're very well captained by the commander called Ali Hakim. And after a really violent sea battle, the ships are all captured by these brilliant corsairs. The men are seized, and they now know that they're not going to be going back to England to see their families. They are heading straight for Morocco, and what they all fear is that they are going to be sold in the great slave auctions of Morocco.
And I think they're sort of kept on board for some months after they're captured because, the corsairs patrol up and down trying to find other prey. But just as they're coming into port in Morocco, amazingly, an English warship appears. And it's like a race to see if the warship can catch them before they before the corsairs can get back into port.
Yeah, and this is not an uncommon story of that there were many ships were being seized at this time by these corsairs. But they were brilliant navigators. They really knew how to handle these ships called their zebeks. They were known as. They were very fast. They were very easy to manoeuvre. But as you say, they're almost sort of chased into harbour by this English vessel, which is hoping to release these poor captive English fishermen and traders. But alas, no. There's a sort of disaster in the harbour. The ships get caught in a storm, and all sorts of things go wrong. But they particularly go wrong for Thomas Pellow and his fellow Englishmen, because the English ship fails to rescue them, and they're brought ashore to a future which, shall we say, for them is now very, very uncertain.
So I mentioned Thomas Pellow. Who is Thomas Pellow, this 11-year-old boy?
So he's a young 11-year-old from Penryn. We don't know really that much about his family background, because, he was one of just many humble fisher folk who lived on the southwest coast of England at the time, in Cornwall. He was from Penryn. Interestingly, the town flag, the symbol for Penryn at this time, was a Saracen's head. That gives some indication, because I think the backstory is very, very important here, that for over a century, these Barbary corsairs had been raiding, as I say, all the European shores, great European countries, but they'd also been raiding the coastline of England, particularly Cornwall and Devon. And they'd been sailing into harbours, sailing up estuaries into rivers, etc., and literally coming ashore and seizing entire populations, transferring them to their ships and sailing them back to Morocco, where they'd been sold in the slave auctions. This was big business for the Moroccan corsairs, and it was extremely dangerous for those who lived on the south coast of England. So Thomas Pellow and his family would have been well aware of the dangers of where they lived, and they were also well aware that if you went on a trading mission to the Mediterranean, you were, in all likelihood, you're putting yourself in grave danger. Having said that, there was a sort of truce had been struck, by which the great slave trading expeditions undertaken by the Barbary corsairs had stopped. They'd come to a halt. So Thomas Pellow, when he goes off sailing with his uncle, they believe they're sailing in a period where there are no corsairs. They're not going to be chased. They're at no risk. What they don't realise is the truce has come to an end. They're caught in the thick of it.
So maybe now's a good time to introduce the next character in the story, which is a truly remarkable man, actually, Moulay Ismail.
I mean, Moulay Ismail is one of the most extraordinary rulers of this period, I think. He was the Sultan of Morocco, the ruler of Morocco. Morocco had been a completely dysfunctional country up until the time when he came to the throne. It had been divided up between various warlords and brigands. It really was a failed state, if you like. And what Moulay Ismail did, he brought the entire country under his unified rule. And he would rule. Most rulers at this period in this part of the world, they were lucky if they stayed on the throne for a year or more. But Moulay Ismail's dates, get this, it's 1672 to 1727. He ruled for an enormous period of time, and he ruled as a total autocrat, a tyrant, a brutal thug, who had also brought under his control the Barbary corsairs, who were operating out of what was effectively like a sort of privateering or a piratical republic. They had their own city port of Salé, which I mentioned earlier, on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, and it was from this port that they set out on their great expeditions to go and capture people to be sold in the slave auctions. What Moulay Ismail did, he was so powerful that he managed to bring them under his control. So effectively, he had his own privateering, piratical corsair fleet, which carried on doing what it had always done, which was bringing back European slaves for sale in the market, except that now Moulay Ismail had his own monopoly on these European slaves. So whatever was brought into the port of Salé was then transferred to his imperial capital of Meknes, and he got the first choice of all the best slaves, all the fittest young men who might be of use to him.
And you mentioned in your book the way he had of traveling around his capital in his chariot. And is it really true that the chariot was pulled by his eunuchs and also by his wives and concubines? Is that really true?
Well, he certainly had a lot of wives. He had, we believe, up to 500 wives. And yes, it is true because we have many, many eyewitnesses to this. There were huge numbers of European slaves in Morocco at the time. And there are also, we can talk about the various missions to try and buy back these slaves, but generally on the part of churchmen, Protestants or Catholic, in fact, who went there. And they all describe this truly grotesque sight of Moulay Ismail, the brutal thug, being towed around, carted around his capital in this chariot, yes, pulled by his wives and eunuchs, with him whipping them and thrashing them. I mean, quite extraordinary, absolute sort of barbaric practices. And they all describe just the sheer violence and brutality of the man.
And he had this thing, didn't he, when he was in a bad mood, sort of a killing mood, so to speak, he would wear a particular color of costume. I mean, really?
Yeah, and that was actually one of the most reliable eyewitnesses was a Catholic priest who was sent out there to try and buy back some of the slaves who he was holding. And he left an account of, yes, he'd wear green. If you wore green, that was good. Green meant that he was in a good mood and he was unlikely to kill anyone. If he wore yellow, you were in for that was serious, because if he wore yellow, it meant he was in execution mode. And his manner of execution, I mean, it's so grotesque. Torture, decapitation. One of his favourites was sawing people in half. He'd tie them to planks of wood and then have them sawn in half from the from the groin upwards. Not a pleasant sight or experience. And there are graphic accounts, and there are so many accounts, but from so many witnesses, and indeed from the Muslim Arab chroniclers of the time as well. That I think they're pretty trustworthy, these accounts.
But he does have an artistic side to him. Well, at least he has a keen interest in architecture. So, do you want to talk a little bit about his love of palaces?
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that on the throne at the same time as him, as he's ruling Morocco, you have Louis XIV, Louis XIV in France, who of course is building his great palace of Versailles. And both men shared a passion for palaces, particularly having their own royal palaces, and sort of outdoing each other in the scale and magnificence of these opulent palaces that they were building. Now, Moulay Ismail knew all about Versailles, and he wanted something that was way bigger, that would really, tower over anything that Louis XIV was building. So he began this palace he founded his new imperial capital of Meknes, which perhaps some listeners will have been to. It's an extraordinary town in northern Morocco, city in northern Morocco. And the whole town is dominated, even to this day, by these crumbling ruins, these crumbling walls and arches, these are the remnants of Moulay Ismail's palace. And yeah, he wanted to build. It was going to be on a monumental scale. I mean, miles and miles and miles of walls surrounded this palace. So you had Dar Kabir, which means the big one. That was the principal palace. But that was just one of 50 palaces that were going to be on this site. And then, of course, there were barracks for several 100,000 soldiers. There were enormous stables for thousands of horses. There were granaries that were required to feed all these things, all these beasts. And some of those are actually pretty intact to this day. And you can wander through the granaries, and they're just on an absolutely monumental scale. And they were also to be they were going to be extraordinarily luxurious and opulent. And so all the interior walls were covered in the famous Gélie tiling, which you see in Morocco, the kind of mosaic, brightly coloured mosaic tiling. There were fountains, there was crystal, there was beautiful stucco, there were painted cedarwood ceilings. This was quite the most gorgeous place you could ever wish to, dream of. And the accounts of the Western visitors, the ambassadors, and the various priests who went to try and buy back the slaves, they were all just eye-popping in their descriptions of this place. They'd never seen anything quite like it. And of course, that included, he wanted to outdo the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. So there's a huge sort of hanging gardens that were being constructed. And it was said, and it might not be fictional, it was said that he intended his palace to stretch from Meknes all the way down to Marrakesh, which is hundreds of miles. Unfortunately for him, he never got down to completing it. But he did build the sort of centerpiece, which is already absolutely enormous. It's effectively a city in its own right, except that it was his own palace complex.
But he's also not a fool, is he? I mean, he goes to war against various European enclaves on the coast of Morocco, and he does manage to knock out quite a lot of them, doesn't he?
He does. I mean, yes, and there are, of course, there are still a couple of Spanish enclaves to this day in Morocco, but there were many, many more at this time, and Portuguese ones as well down the Atlantic coast of Morocco. And you're absolutely right. He'd assembled an extremely powerful and well-equipped army. A lot of it black slaves from which had been brought up from sub-Saharan Africa. And they were an army to be reckoned with. And yes, he did, one by one, tried to wipe out all of these blots on his empire, if you like, and was extremely efficient. His power was very great. He saw himself very much as an equal, if not a superior, of the great monarchs of Europe at the time. So it's funny that really nowadays very few people in Britain, I would think, would know anything about Moulay Ismail, but at the time, everyone would have known about him because he was the scourge of Europe.
I mean, that's interesting what you say, because this is just another of these forgotten stories. I mean, it's just disappeared from our consciousness, and yet at the time, just about everybody knew about him. Just to build on
what you just said, also, when I first started writing this book, I knew absolutely nothing about the trade in white slaves. It was never taught at school. It was never mentioned at all. And yet, between about 1600 and 1800, and those dates are slightly expandable, it's reckoned that more than 1 million Christian Europeans were sold into the great slave markets of Morocco and Algiers and Tunis. So this was okay. It's not on the scale of the transatlantic slave trade, which involved up to 12, 13 million people. But nevertheless, this was slavery on a grand scale, and it's never spoken about and never taught in schools.
This is perhaps specific to Morocco, but as I understand it, one of the things that turbocharged the whole thing was when King Philip expelled all the Moors from Spain back in 1610. And I think there's about 1 million of them. So that's a huge population. And some of the toughest and the most enterprising of them end up in Salé. So anyway, do you want to say a little bit about how the Salé raiders got started?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is King Philip III of Spain kicked out the Spanish Moors, the Muslims of living in Spain. And they had to find a new homeland. And well, they went to the nearest place available that would accept them, which was Morocco, and many of them settled on the coast. And in particular, they settled in this place called Salé, which is just on the estuary, just opposite Rabat, which is today the capital of Morocco. And these days, it's a rather rundown little port with a daily market, selling all sorts of, everything from vegetables to kettles or whatever. But in 1600, this was the slave market. And so actually the buildings you see today selling vegetables where, several hundred years ago, they were selling European Christians in that very market. And so they settled there. They were very good at shipping, and they began building fleets of ships and really began raiding the coasts. Almost one can see it as revenge for being evicted from what they considered to be their homeland. So they started raiding the shores of all the Christian countries around the Mediterranean and indeed up the Atlantic coast of France and England. And indeed, even further afield, one of the most notable and extraordinary raids was on Reykjavik. They went all the way to Iceland and carried off some 200, 300 people from Reykjavik. And even more astonishing, they crossed the Atlantic and they started raiding the Newfoundland banks, which of course were rich in fish and so attracted numerous European fishermen, and those who'd settled in North America were fishing the Newfoundland banks, and they were easy prey. They were in ships with no guns. They were quite easy to capture. And so, these people were capturing these ships from far and wide and bringing back their crews, and then they got sold in the slave auctions of Salé.
And there's one very famous raid on England, isn't there, in 1625, where I think they picked up as many as 1,000 slaves. And what's more, they managed to capture the island of Lundy and sort of set up a base there. Actually, I was talking to, on another podcast, I was talking to Professor David Abulafia about Lundy, and he said he didn't think it was possible for the raiders to set up a base there unless they had some support from the local people. So, for supplies and that kind of thing. And I thought that was quite an interesting observation.
If you look at the state papers from the time, this is a real crisis for the government at the time. And there's quite a lot about the seizure of Lundy. And you mentioned that infamous raid where one village that was attacked was the village of Loo, which people might know in Cornwall. And what they tended to do, they'd come ashore on a Sunday because they knew that most of the villagers would be in church, and they'd simply surround the church and then capture the lot and march them back to their ships and take them up and sail away with them. But you're right, the seizure of Lundy caused real problems. This was a big crisis, and the government in London simply didn't have any answers. They just didn't know how to protect these seaports. They didn't have the necessary fleet to be able to combat this absolute menace which carried on for decades and decades.
So let's talk about the slaves then. Once they've been brought to shore, so what happens to them? Are they basically well looked after, and what kind of work are they put to?
Well, first of all, when they're brought ashore, the first thing that normally happened to them was that they were put into these underground dungeons, which were known as matamores, and they were held there, really leading up to the slave auctions. And often they were given quite good food, and there were many of them said, "We're being fattened up for the slaughter," as it were. That was in the early years. By the time Moulay Ismail has taken control of Morocco, they are his personal property. So let's take the case of Thomas Pellow and his crew from the Francis. They are taken inland to Meknes, marched inland, and there they are taken to the parade ground where they will be inspected by Moulay Ismail, who's going to take the fittest and the choicest of them into his personal collection of slaves, if you like. And Moulay Ismail wants these slaves for a very specific purpose. As we said, he's building this absolutely monumentally vast palace, and he wants it to be entirely built by Christian European slave labour. So all of the fittest slaves, the young men with big muscles, he'll say, well, I'll have them because they're going to be useful for working on this vast building project. And so that's what happened to the majority of them, of various different nationalities. They'd be held in pitiful conditions, really appalling conditions. They'd be fed terrible, minimal rations just to keep them out of starvation. And they'd be forced to work incredibly long hours, physically punishing work, building the walls of this palace. These walls, as I say, they still exist, and they're 30, 40, 50 feet high. And they're built of this stuff called pisse, which is like a mixture of sand and lime mortar. which unfortunately for Moulay Ismail crumbles after a few years, which is why the ruins now, there's just this crumbling mass of walls in Meknes. But also it's pretty horrible stuff to be mixing lime mortar. It burns you. They all complained of burns. They complained of hunger constantly, and they were constantly thrashed by the Black Guard, the dreaded Black Guard. These were Moulay Ismail's most loyal supporters, champions, if you like. They were the sort of the equivalent of the SS, They were there to protect him, and they were there to make sure that the slaves worked relentlessly, 15, 16 hours a day. And they all carried cudgels, and they would beat anyone who stopped working. So this was a miserable, hideous existence, and countless slaves died. And when they died, they were simply built into the walls of the palace. So, to this day, those walls are full of bones of human skeletons, of unfortunate slaves who died on the job.
And this Black Guard, they're slaves too. So it's kind of a bit like the Ottoman Janissaries. It's like it's a slave army. Is that right?
That's exactly right. They are slaves, but they're sort of they're esteemed slaves, if you like. So they have much better access to food. It's almost like when you read about concentration camps, and there's a sort of hierarchy of guards in the concentration camps. It's almost like they're top of the slave hierarchy, if you like. They have access to better food, to better conditions, and they are there to beat those under them. So they lorded it over the other slaves, particularly the white Christian European slaves under their control.
There's a great book called The White Tiger, which is set in India, and it's talking about the caste system. And the author says that India is like this giant hen house where every hen has an absolutely miserable life because they're being constantly picked on by a hen on the rung above. But the hens as a whole never revolt because there's always someone lower than them that they can peck at in turn. And I guess the Black Guards are busy pecking the Christians who are, sat one rung below them. So in a sense, they are privileged and they get much better rations, but they're still very much at risk, aren't they? I mean, the Sultan, Moulay Ismail, he still treats them with grotesque violence, doesn't he?
Absolutely. And there are countless testimonies of Black Guards who get on the wrong side of Moulay Ismail. Often it's a complete trifle. They do something, they step on the wrong way or something like that. And Moulay Ismail will simply, if he's wearing his yellow clothes, he will simply pull out his sword and chop their head off. There's countless stories of decapitations and, hideous brutality. But that was the reality of life for this hierarchy of slaves under Moulay Ismail's total control.
But as I understand it, Thomas Pellow, he doesn't get set to work on the walls. So what happens to him when he's brought in? Because he's kind of taken to one side, isn't he?
Yeah, he's very young at this stage, and I think that he's seen as somebody who could be moulded in the way that could be very useful in this palace environment. And so he's actually he first of all he works for one of Moulay Ismail's sons, and then he ends up being given to a courtier. And he is basically being groomed to become a sort of palace retainer. So he will remain a slave, but he will be climbing up that hierarchy. So if you like, he's on a different trajectory to the crew, the rest of the crew on the Francis, who are put to work building the palace and just doing this arduous building work for 15 hours a day. So he's already been singled out, and this is going to be his story of his time in Morocco.
And they force him to convert, don't they? And this is one of the bits of the story which I do wonder if he's exaggerating a bit or not. But as he tells the story, they torture him absolutely relentlessly for week after week. I don't know quite how long it takes, but eventually he agrees to convert to Islam. And I just wondered if you thought that story was true, or does he gild the lily a bit because of the shame that there would be of turning away from Christianity and becoming a Muslim?
Yeah, it's a good question and a difficult one to answer, because they called it turning Turk, where it was that if a captured European slave agreed to convert to Islam, they instantly got better rations, they got better conditions, and they were better treated. So there was a lot of incentive to turn Turk, to become a Muslim. But there were two problems with this. First of all, it was deemed utterly shameful on your fellow slave, your fellow countryman wouldn't talk to you anymore. That was the most shameful thing you could possibly do. And more importantly, you would never be bought back by your home country, because there were repeated attempts to ransom, to buy back some of these slaves that had been sold into captivity in Morocco. If you had turned Turk, if you had converted to Islam, basically your home government would have nothing more to do with you. You were considered to have gone over to the other side. So that perhaps explains why Thomas Pellow was so reluctant to convert to Islam, because he knew if he did that, the rest of his life would be spent in Morocco, unless he was able to escape. So you're right in saying he was brutally treated, he was tortured, and eventually he was broken by it. He was still a young lad at the time, and he agreed. Now, with his account, it's very difficult to work out what he's added in for colour and what was actually true. But I did my very best all the way through to try and verify his account with other contemporary accounts of the time, and also compare it with the stories of the Moroccan chroniclers of the time, who were chronicling, of course, everything that was happening in Moulay Ismail's court. And I came to the conclusion, and I'm not alone in this, that much of his story really is verifiable, and there may be moments where he adds in some colour, but I think that the story of him being beaten and tortured to turn Turk there's no reason not to believe that that's true.
And turning Turk, I think that involves a rather humiliating ritual where you're publicly circumcised.
Yes, it was a fairly painful thing to undergo, and like you say, humiliating. It was done in public, and like I said, once you've done that, there is no going back. You've sort of signed on the other side, if you like, and you're with them. You're not with your old shipmates anymore. So a major thing to have happened in his life, and he fears that that's it. He is doomed now to spend his life as a slave, albeit higher up in the hierarchy, but he's doomed to spend his life as a slave in Moulay Ismail's Morocco.
You say he moves up the hierarchy, and there's a great story in the book about how he becomes assigned. I don't quite know what the post is, but I think it's chief porter or something like that. But anyway, he ends up guarding the doors to the harem. He's not actually allowed into the harem, but he's guarding the doors. And nobody is allowed in at any time except the Sultan. And after a certain time, nobody's allowed in, even the Sultan, unless he's given sort of prior notice that he's going to be coming. And so one night, the Sultan turns up after hours, demanding to be let in. And poor old Pellow, he's on the other side, desperately wondering what he should do.
It's a wonderful moment, actually. And what on earth do you do when you have Moulay Ismail, you are under the strictest instructions, on pain of death, not to open the doors of the harem to anyone? And then you have this booming voice on the other side. And is it Moulay Ismail or isn't it? And you can see Thomas Pellow not knowing what to do. And he thinks, I can't open that door, because if I open that door, I'm going to be killed because I've gone against the express command of the Sultan. But if I don't open that door, he wants to come in. So what do I do? So it's a fantastic episode in his book, and ultimately he makes the right decision, which is not to open the door, which is exactly what he meant to do.
And the Sultan, he's absolutely furious at the time, and he promises all sorts of retribution. And I can't quite remember, but I think the next day it's the people who let the Sultan get so far as he did that are executed, and Pellow is actually rewarded.
Yes, there was absolutely no mercy in the court of Moulay Ismail. Those who didn't do what he said were always going to be executed. But there's a number of instances like this in young Thomas Pellow's his sort of early years in Morocco, where he makes the right decision. He gets the right call, if you like. And this helps him enormously because with every right call, you inch up the hierarchy a little bit more.
And he does move up the hierarchy, at least in the sense that he becomes a sufficient favourite of the Sultan that he gets awarded a wife. I don't know how many hundreds of women are in the courtyard who are sort of assembled there, and then they bring in the men, and Muley Ismail, very generously assigns a wife to each of them. It's quite a story.
18th century version of Blind Date, They're all assembled in this palace courtyard, and Muley Ismail delights in sort of pairing them off. Of course, there was a good reason for this, is that if your slave marries another slave, they're quite likely to have children, and thereby you've just increased your slave population. So there was method to this madness, as Muley Ismail was well aware. It was a great way of keeping up the numbers.
There was another bit here where I wondered if he was just exaggerating a little bit, because he says he turns down the first two wives that he's offered because their complexion is too dark, and he wants somebody, more his own colour. And I wonder if in, his account, he's trying to emphasize that he's still a European and that he never turned away from his mother country.
And this is going to be vital. There's going to be a spoiler alert here, isn't there? If he ever gets back to England, he's got to prove to the English authorities that he didn't mean it when he converted to Islam. And so at every possible opportunity in the account that he writes, he sort of says he was forced into doing it, he was tortured into doing it. When he had to choose a wife, he tried to find one that looked as English as possible, So he's really stressing this point. And yes, it makes for a good story, but there is a very, very, a good reason behind it, which is he wants to be accepted back into English society at the end of it, which is by no means evident. This is to have converted to Islam at this period was, a monumental thing to have done, and very much frowned upon by the authorities back at home. So yes, there is a very good reason why he wants to stress this all the way through his account.
Actually, I did a podcast about the witch trials in Salem, and there was a clergyman called Cotton Mather, who was, a major character in the American colonies at the time, and he was one of the most influential clergymen. The reason for speaking about him in the podcast was that he was very much involved in getting to grips with witchcraft there, but he had much wider interests. And reading your book, I see he was also writing sermons, basically saying that if you've been captured and taken to North Africa, to Morocco or wherever, and you turn away from Christianity, then no matter what pressure you're under, there's no way back. I mean, this is really, for him, this is an unforgivable sin. And it was just interesting to me to see Mather popping up again.
Yeah, I mean, because of course, as I said, the Barbary Corsairs were raiding the shores of New England and Virginia and the coast, the Atlantic coast of America, and Americans were being captured and they were being sold into slavery. Cotton Mather was giving these fiery sermons, exactly that, denouncing anyone who would dare turn away from Christianity. They were selling their souls to the devil. It's real fire and brimstone stuff, his sermons. He didn't hold back at all.
I found it interesting trying to work out what happens to the crew of the Francis and what happens to the crew of the other ships. And I think quite a lot of them just die of overwork or disease or whatever. But there's always the chance that you might at some period be ransomed. And it was a really interesting aspect of the book. You go through, I don't know exactly, I think it's from the mid-1600s up to when Pello becomes a slave in 1715 or thereabouts, and maybe a bit after. And you talk about various attempts to ransom slaves. And it's quite interesting because I think you said that the average price of one male slave on one particular occasion when they were trying to do the ransoming, I think you said £38 a head. But that was for the men, and for the women it was much, much more expensive. So there was a woman called Sarah Ripley who was from London, and apparently it cost £800 to ransom her. And there was another woman called Mary Brewster, and it cost £1,300 to ransom her.
Yeah, I mean, these are vast sums of money. They really are huge sums of money for the period. And also there were far fewer female slaves, European slaves, than male ones. So they had a rarity value. And they got fewer as time went on, as there were fewer raids on the shorelines of England. And it was more ships being captured. And of course, ships were manned by men. So many more men were captured. So how this worked was that the slaves were allowed to write letters home, because the Sultan knew that, nothing better than to have begging letters sent back to England saying, please ransom us, we're being held in the most terrible conditions, that these letters would get circulated, they get into the press, and people would demand that the government did something about it. So, and the government did, or they tried to anyway. They would send out various missions, various ambassadors. They would send out churchmen. The French particularly, they sent out numerous Catholic priests to try and do deals with Sultan Moulay Ismail and his various, senior sort of court executives, if you like. And it involved huge sums of money. So they were literally bought back. These priests or these ambassadors would go over with sacks of money and hopefully come back with a ship full of slaves. But it was... The problem is, we see this nowadays. If the story of the Americans recently released in Iran, what happens if you pay to get back somebody who's been kidnapped or being taken hostage or being sold into slavery? Of course, it simply encourages the trade. And so for every, 50 slaves they brought back, well, the corsairs would go out and capture another few ships, and knowing that this was a way to make lots of money.
There was various attempts to ransom slaves, and more often than not, as I read your book, they seem to have been a complete failure, because maybe it's because Moulay Ismail needs them to work on the palaces, or maybe they've offended him in some way. But you do describe one successful attempt. Well, there were a number of successful attempts, but you do describe one in particular where Commodore Stewart finally manages to bring back about 300 slaves to London. And there's this huge celebration in St. Paul's. And I was struck, though, by the irony of all this, because it's exactly this time that England is, it's up to its armpits in the transatlantic slave trade.
It really was an amazing spectacle. And what got to me was that before they landed in London, they made sure that these pitiful, ex-captives looked as terrible as possible. So they told them, put back on your jellabas, which are all torn and filthy, and that they couldn't eat for a few days to make them look really hungry. And so they really, you're right, they absolutely made it into a spectacle. It was the talk of the town, and all the penny dreadfuls were reporting on, these slaves had been released. But you're absolutely right. At the same time, Britain was indulging itself in the slave trade, and let's not forget as well, Rule Britannia rules the waves, Britons never shall be slaves. Well, they were at the very time when that was written. There were countless slaves being held in the various cities of the Barbary states, as they were known. So there's irony upon irony in this story.
Let's move on to talk about Pello's attempts to get out, because he does attempt to escape. And his first attempt, because by this stage he speaks Arabic, and his face has been burned black by the sun, he can pass for a local, I guess. So he has this fairly simple idea of just walking. And I can't remember which of the enclaves it is, but he walks straight through to, I think it's a Spanish enclave, and he sort of knocks on the door and says, "Can I come in, please?"
Yeah, in fact, it's Portuguese. It's Mazagan, which is today known as El Jadida, which is a beautiful port on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. And you're right, he almost sort of gets there. It's sort of so frustrating when you read about it, because he's almost there, and then he gets recaptured, and once he's recaptured, he's in very real danger of being executed, because this is the absolute worst thing you could ever do, is try and escape. But, he's the cat with 9 lives. He really is, because every time something terrible happens to him, he somehow gets away with it. And that's what happens on this occasion. he gets released on the understanding that he won't try again. But by now, he's got escape in his blood. He's really determined to get out of this situation. He's already, just to give a bit of backstory, he's been fighting in the army, in the Sultan's army. He's taken part in numerous extremely dangerous campaigns across the Sahara even. He goes on a slave raiding expedition. So I think he realizes that he's not going to live forever, and he's got to get out sooner rather than later. And so you're right, he makes numerous attempts to get out.
Can we just talk a bit about the raid across the Sahara? Because Pello is part of this giant expedition right across the Sahara and into Guinea. And you have there's a wonderful story, which I thought it could come straight out of Herodotus, where there's this blind guide who's leading them, and he navigates by sort of scooping up the sand and smelling it.
That's an absolutely extraordinary story. And I wondered whether to believe it or not, when I first read that. But you're absolutely right. So they're led across the Sahara by somebody who's completely blind. Yeah, and you're right. And he scoops up sand, and from the smell, he says he can tell exactly where the next oasis is going to be and the next water source is going to be. And he's extraordinarily accurate. And actually, they don't quite believe him. They try to trick him. So what they do at one point, they scoop up sand, and then about 3 days later, he wants to sniff the sand, to find out where they are and where the water source is. And they give him the sand that they dug up 3 days earlier. And he's sort of really puzzled. He said, hold on a minute. If that's the sand from here, we've been going around in a giant circle. We're back to where we've been. And they couldn't quite believe it. Thomas Pello is absolutely finds this absolutely extraordinary. But this blind man was not alone. There were others as well who guided people across the desert like this. So, yeah, it's an extraordinary story, but one has to believe it, I think, because they certainly make it to water always just in time.
And there's this really striking irony here, isn't there? Because the French have a strong slaving presence in the area where the expedition is going. I think the French are based on the River Senegal, and a bit further south in Gambia, there's a British slave station. So the idea is that Pello, who wants to escape, he's going to be helped, he hopes, by the Europeans who are themselves slavers.
It's extraordinary. You've got a slave, Thomas Pello, going on a slave-snatching expedition and bumping into fellow Europeans who are there to capture slaves. I mean, there's everyone in the story seems to be involved in some way in this slave trade.
And there's sort of irony piled on irony, because they do come across a French ship, which I think it's a supply vessel for the French slavers. And the Moroccans promptly charge on board and they take all the French captive. And the French are eventually hauled back to Meknes to join the other European slaves there.
And this sort of thing happens all the time. Yeah, it's extraordinary. Everyone seems to be preying on everyone else.
And just to say, and I don't really want to do much comparing because I think it becomes invidious. But you make the point in your book, life as a slave in Morocco, it would be absolutely miserable. But conditions for enslaved North Africans in the North American plantations would have been just horrific. Yeah,
it's always difficult to make comparisons. But I think, when you read accounts of particularly the passage across the Atlantic for the slaves who are being bought in Africa and taken across to the North American continent, I mean, the conditions were absolutely horrific. And so many died en route. And it wasn't quite the same in Morocco. Having said that, you only have to look at the mortality rate of the European slaves in Morocco to realise that they're not being treated well.
Yeah. So escape number 2, escape number 1 so nearly succeeds, but now we're on to escape number 2. And there's a bit of a boy's own adventure feel to it, because Pello has this idea that he's going to get a couple of Moroccans drunk and then he'll steal their boat. And again, that comes pretty close to being successful, doesn't it?
Yeah, this is in 1728, 1729, so he's been a slave a long time by this period. He's desperate to get out, and he strikes a deal with a fellow slave, a chap called William Hussey, and they're going to try and capture a small boat. And look, you're right, it's owned by 2 Moroccans. They're going to get them drunk on brandy and then steal their boat. They need a third person. This boat cannot be sailed with 2 people. So they team up with a third European slave, And all's going well. It looks like it's going to happen. And of course, what they're going to do is sail to Gibraltar, British-held Gibraltar. And from there, they hope they're going to secure passage home. So, it's not that far to have to sail. And they're pretty sure they can, they're fairly competent at sea. They're fairly sure they're going to do it. And at the last moment, this third slave who's agreed to take part backs out and betrays them. And their whole plan, so close to taking place, it all falls apart. And once again, they find themselves in great danger.
And I love how they dealt with it. They turn on the guy that betrays them, saying, no, it wasn't us. It was his idea. We just went along until we could turn him in.
It's a fantastic moment of betrayal. And it's 2 against 1. They've got 2 stories and he's only got 1. And so they're believed and he isn't. So, yeah, they turn the tables very nicely on him and he gets his comeuppance.
And then it's rather sad because Pello's wife and daughter, they now die, I think.
Yeah, I think the death of his wife and his daughter, I think probably that cuts any emotional ties he might have had to the country. And this is the point where he's going to really make his third and final attempt to get out. It's 1737. He's 33 years old by now. You remember he was captured when he was 11. He's spent a long time in slavery. And it happens at the little port of Wiladia, it's called, on the Atlantic coast again of Morocco. There are 2 ships at anchor, and one of them is an Irish ship, and it's got a captain, is commanded by a chap called Captain Tubin, who Pello makes contact with and who is appalled by his story and agrees to help him get out. Basically, will take him on board his ship and sail away with him. And this is going to be the third and final escape attempt, which is successful.
And in fairness, you've allied it a bit because getting to that ship, it sounds like the most horrific journey as he's trying to walk and walk and walk over a really large distance and he's running out of food. He's being attacked by bandits and he's quite seriously injured, in the attack. And so this isn't just a question of walking down to the port and hopping on a ship.
No, you're right. And it's a monumental journey, and he describes it in great detail in his account. And all of the time he's on this march to get to a port where he can find a European ship, he's in grave danger. He's on the run. He's an escapee. And so at any time, he knows his past can catch up with him and he will be, he may well be captured. And this time he'll certainly be executed. Third time you're on the run, you're not 3 times lucky in Moulay Ismail's Morocco. And so, he has this extraordinary journey. He various disguises. He pretends at one point he's a physician, all sorts of things to get him to ultimately to this port where Captain Tubin's ship is fortuitously at anchor.
But he's quite lucky, isn't he? Because not all European ships are going to be happy to welcome a European slave on board.
Very much not. And I think he's very lucky that it's an Irish captain, not an English one. I'm not sure an English captain would have, believed his story. You've got to remember that Thomas Pello, as I say, he's been in the country for a very long time. He's got a long black beard. He's dressed in a jellaba. He doesn't even look English anymore. And it probably is speaking English, probably faulty English with a strong Moroccan accent, So he's got to convince the captain that he's English, that he was captured when he was 11 years old, and the whole story's got to come out, and he's got to be believed before a captain who it's not really in a captain's interest to take this person back to England. So he's very lucky that Captain Tubin, Irish, believes his story and agrees to help.
And again, the captain, I suppose if the Moroccans find out that the captain is helping runaways, that's going to be a problem for the captain.
Yes, and this is a period, perhaps to explain that business has resumed up to a point with these Moroccan ports. It's extremely dangerous. They have to be extremely careful, and there are very few of these trading missions to Morocco. Moulay Ismail is dead by now. He's finally succumbed, and there's been all sorts of civil wars and fighting and infighting and all sorts of sort of shenanigans going on. But this, I think, aids Thomas Pellew as well. The fact that the Sultan has died, he sees another window of opportunity here, and he goes for it. He's very lucky that he gets to the port of Viladia just at the time when these two vessels are in the harbour.
And it's a bit of a diversion, but you mentioned the fact that the kingdom sort of degenerates into some kind of anarchy. And it just made me smile because Moulay Ismail, with his probably over 1,000 children and they say 700 sons, I mean, there's no shortage of people there to claim the throne. So it's not surprised that it sort of turns into a bloodbath.
No. In fact, on Wikipedia, there's a site which names all the men in history who've sired the most children. And Moulay Ismail's up there, quite high up, below Genghis Khan. But he, by all accounts, he had at least 500. No, hang on. He had at least 800 children, and perhaps as many as 1,200, all of whom have a claim on the throne. So, it's hardly surprising, as you say, that as soon as he dies, there's this kind of massive scramble to get onto the throne, and but it's the same story that repeats itself over and over again in Moroccan history. Is that every time, right up until the 20th century, I should say, that every time a sultan dies, there's an enormous fight over who becomes the next leader.
Okay, so Pellew, he makes his way home, and I think always with these cases when somebody's been away a long time, I guess you see this in many different situations, but when somebody's been away a long time, been out of their home environment, it's never a completely happy ending, is it?
No, I mean, by the time he finally makes it back to England, he's been a slave for 23 years. So the vast, proportion of his life has been spent in Morocco. He only spent 11 years in England. He gets back, he goes to London. He's taken to London, first of all, a city he's never been to in his life, and eventually makes his way back to Penryn, to his native town, where all the townsfolk turn out to see him. This the prodigal son returns, as it were, and he finally meets his parents, both of whom are still alive. Neither of them recognise him. They have absolutely no idea who this bearded, sunburned individual coming towards them. They have absolutely no idea that this is their little Thomas Pellew, who disappeared all those years, 23 years earlier, aged 11. I think probably for them it's the biggest shock of their lives. And I think you're right. We don't know. The story sort of stops there because he stops his account there. And it would be wonderful to have an epilogue, really, to the story, which is what happened next. We just don't know. We know nothing more than where he stops his own account. It's frustrating, but like you say, it must have been extraordinarily difficult to reassimilate back into the little community of Penryn.
And as you say, we don't really know what happens next to Pellew, but you have a nice ending to your book where someone, and he's not a direct descendant of Pellew, but I think he's some kind of relative. And about 100 years later, this guy is instrumental in finally crushing the Barbary corsairs. And I think that's in 1816, and that's Sir Edward Pellew.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary story. And although the surname is not quite the same, so it's Pellew and he's Pellew, it is actually, it's ultimately the branch of the same family. So there's a sort of poetic justice in a way that Sir Edward Pellew, great naval commander, incidentally, in 1816, he's sent down into the Mediterranean. And by that point, the great sort of slave trade has moved to Algiers, and there are a lot of European slaves being held in Algiers. And Sir Edward Pellew basically issues an ultimatum to the ruler of Algiers at the time: hand over your slaves or I'm just going to bomb you to dust. And the ruler refuses, and so Sir Edward Pellew just gets all his cannon loaded and fires shot after shot after shot into Algiers, literally destroying the city. I mean, the damage done is absolutely catastrophic, to the point where ultimately the local ruling Dey submits and releases his slaves. And slavery doesn't quite come to an end there, but there's a break here. The great chain of slavery that's been going on since 1600 or before is brought to a halt at this point.
Well, that's a great ending for the book and for the podcast, perhaps. Okay, well, let's end it there. But I just am curious to know, because I've been enjoying working through your back catalogue enormously. I'm just interested to know what's on the stocks.
Well, actually, last week I finished my latest book, so it's quite a big moment for me. It's always, for every author, finishing a book is very exciting, and it's called The Stalin Affair. This is coming right up to the 20th century, and it's a story really of three people, two Americans and one Brit, who were sent to Moscow during the war, and they were sent into the Kremlin to deal directly with Stalin. Because Stalin, of course, one of the big three wartime allies, there's Churchill, there's Roosevelt, and there's Stalin. And it was felt by both Roosevelt and Churchill that they needed a sort of team, if you like, in Moscow to deal directly with Stalin and work alongside him. So they became incredibly close to Stalin. And it's absolutely fascinating, the accounts that they sent home. And one of the three, Averell Harriman, took along his daughter, Kathy Harriman, who was an impressionable 24-year-old at the time. And she wrote hundreds of letters home about life in Moscow, about life in the Kremlin, about the extraordinary banquets that Stalin held, where she had to give toasts to Stalin and his commissars. An extraordinary and completely unknown chapter of history, which I hope I will have brought vividly to life. That was my intention anyway.
I honestly don't know where you find these stories, because you just again and again you pick up this stuff that I just had no idea about these stories.
Well, I'm looking for new ones right now, so if you have any good ideas, do call me afterwards.
Well, I'll let you know if I think of something. And in the meantime, thank you so much, Giles Milton.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, and you have the time, then a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or wherever it is, that would be fantastic. And generally, if you have any feedback at all, do feel free to drop me a line. My email is hog.russell@gmail.com, and that's 2 G's, 2 S's and 2 L's. Okay, that's it. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll be listening again next time. So, bye for now.